back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And as always, I look forward to talking with my next guest. You know him well from Economic Update Tuesday evenings on Free Speech TV, from democracyatwork.info, his latest book, The Sickness is the System. Richard Wolff is an economist and economic historian. He's a professor at a bunch of places, but we got a lot to talk about. So we'll skip that part and go straight to the good stuff. Richard Wolff, as always, thanks for coming on the program.
And thank you, RJ, for inviting me.
And by the good stuff, I mean the bad stuff. Here's one of the things that just blew me away about the last week's news coverage. Somewhere in there among let's say all the gossip about Kamala Harris's staffing problems and, you know, which celebrity was in trouble with which other celebrity, was this little nugget. Chemical pollution has passed safe limit for humanity, say scientists, and a study calls for a cap on production and release as pollution and threatens global ecosystems on which life depends. Now, we've been talking about this for years now. There's a movie about it now, Don't Look Up. But you'd think that something that imperils humanity might warrant something other than page A12 in the, if it's in the A section at all, of the newspaper. You'd think that we would be more concerned about it. That seems to be the case, wouldn't you think?
Well, you might have if you lived in a rational society, but we don't. And so I guess we've come to the point where the business interests have been able to shape the public discussion on the media and beyond in such a way as to minimize exposure for what embarrasses them and maximize exposure for whatever exalts them, real or imagined. And you can unpack it around this plastics issue in two simple ways. Number one, the logic of capitalism is that business is in business to make a profit. Profit is the bottom line. Profit is the goal. Profit is the measure by which you reward companies and executives. And if you don't get a good profit, it's the measure by which you punish them in terms of their stock price or losing their job or all of the above. And as a result, whatever their personal inclinations might be, they know that in the long and the short run, profit maximization has to be their number one priority. So if a side effect of making more profit is to pollute the oceans and the air with chemical waste, with plastics, which have now been found literally in the deepest levels of our oceans and at the top of Mount Everest and everywhere in between, well, that's too bad. That is what the military call collateral damage. You know, that's when the drone, instead of hitting its intended target, wipes out a wedding party or a funeral procession for people who are, in all senses of the word, innocent. It's collateral damage of capitalism. And we're supposed to kind of understand that, or at least look away when the collateral damage, like the drone attack on the wedding, is very embarrassing. And the other thing is that the same big businesses that are wrapped up in polluting the ocean with plastic have, interlocking directorships with the huge corporations that run our mass media. And so it's no accident, whether it's intended or conspiratorial or not, it's no accident that we have come to have notions of ecological damage made routine. There's a regular production of questions of being skeptical about whatever the claim is, fossil fuel, plastic, it doesn't really matter. Whatever the claim is, you dredge up some scientists who are for sale, who will write a few articles that will get widely distributed about why it isn't as bad as some people say, or it may go away on its own, or there's other factors we should be interested in. You muddy the waters the way we now know the cigarette companies did with all the accumulated science about tobacco and nicotine, and what we now recently learned Exxon has done for decades. So we know what they do, and the end result is most Americans don't know anything about it. And if there is a story, well, it's on page A, double digit buried in the newspaper next to the advertisement for dog food.
And you mentioned drones. One of the headlines that caught my eye this week in the New York Times, they were releasing newly declassified video showing the U.S. killing of 10 civilians in a drone strike in Kabul. We knew that this had happened. The video has been released by the military now. But the headline, which caught my eye, Richard Wolff, is very related to what you just said new video shows botched Kabul drone strike. And my reaction to that word botched was, botched is something you say when, I painted the kitchen the wrong color. I botched it, or I put the wrong kind of snow tires on my car. Botched is hardly, it seems to me, the kind of word to describe the mass murder of 10 innocent people, including 7 children. But it seems to me this is part of the same mindset, isn't it? That says that if we can't hide it, or if we have to pretend to be coming clean in some way because you caught us somehow, you, the public, word got out to you, that we're going to say, oh, oops, as opposed to, my God, this is a moral monstrosity. What are we going to do to make sure this never happens again? Aren't they connected?
Absolutely. You do this kind of mind control stuff on a big scale and then on a little scale, like the choice of a headline. A person who's wrapped up in the ideology that governs this society now makes that decision. Doesn't use the word slaughter or murder or any other word that would draw attention. It's a minimization job. This is a botched operation, and which is how the military look at it. They didn't quite work out the way it does. And so nothing is said about the fact that there were thousands of drone strikes in Afghanistan, and that this is one of many that didn't work. That, like the smart bombs in the Vietnam War, once you had a few years pass, turns out they weren't so smart after all. They depend on intelligence. Intelligence was not smartly organized, if even it could be when you're an occupying power. None of the bigger questions about how to think about this are broached, let alone investigated, and you quickly paper it all over by plastering this word botched on it. Even the very phrase collateral damage is, there's a primary and then there's this secondary thing. It's already organizing how people think about, how they hear, how they process the realities, which is why Americans have such a different idea about our, for example, military activities abroad than do the people where those activities occur, because one of them lives through it and the other one has the whole thing presented through the most amazing rose-colored glasses.
Now, this may sound like an odd digression, but believe me, I think there's a through line here. Richard Wolff, I don't know if you've ever heard the expression tanky, but it gets thrown around a lot to describe people that are supposedly much too infatuated with totalitarian left-wing governments and therefore blinded to the injustices that the good peoples of this world face from the so-called left. And now that's not to say that governments of all political ideologies haven't done terrible things. Of course they have. And that's not to say that there may not be people out there who are blind to do it. But I bring it up because I was called a tanky not too long ago. Why? Because the newspapers were filled with a phenomenon described as basically a proven phenomenon called the Havana syndrome. Now, If you've heard about the Havana syndrome, then undoubtedly you heard for months that nefarious forces, probably Russian or Chinese or both, were bombarding United States personnel and embassies and elsewhere with invisible electronic rays that were causing a variety of symptoms that to me sounded suspiciously like some of the psychosomatic things you see in the medical literature and so on. But, undoubtedly people genuinely suffered with headaches and other symptoms caused by various causes. But to question the existence of Havana syndrome caused me, and I'm sure others, to be described as tankies or as fanatical deniers of certain forms of evil. I would also remind you, and then I'll stop and let you react. But in September, Congress, according to the New York Times, Congress unanimously passed Helping American Victims Afflicted by Neurological Attacks Act, or the Havana Act. Now the CIA has just announced that it's not real, that there is, in fact, no evidence for anything called the Havana syndrome. When Congress unanimously passed it, that is, every member of both parties who voted for it, to provide financial support to sufferers of these neurological symptoms. Marco Rubio, one of the authors of the bill, said that those skeptical of the theory were, quote unquote, influence agents, end quote, paid or encouraged by, quote, foreign governments or whatever, who don't want this to be discussed out there. You get my point, I think, don't you?
Absolutely. Look, there's anyone who is not really naive in a way that after all these years is not justifiable. So anyone who isn't naive in an unjustifiable way knows that the United States, and not only the United States, has an elaborate global information management program. I'm being as polite as I know how. In the old days, you called this a propaganda agency. Other countries do it. The United States does it. We are not, again, we're not the only one, but that doesn't make us innocent or naive, and it certainly doesn't excuse the kind of grotesque pandering that the Congress demonstrated. It's too dangerous to be politically seen on the other side, so you vote about something you couldn't have known, because since this began, the Cubans have, in a variety of ways, put out a variety of literatures indicating that they don't think that this is going on. The so-called event has happened in other parts of the world, not just in the Cuban embassy, in the U.S. activities around the Guantanamo and in Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. So there was plenty of evidence. You didn't have to take this in the kind of ancient patriotic lopsidedness that it has been treated. But it is a sign that we live in a society in which the manufacturing of information to get what you want has become routinized. I find it remarkable that Americans seem to be surprised that we can't get a straight story about COVID. And the answer is it's the same issue. There are too many interests involved. The pharmaceutical companies want one way of understanding this disease, and of course, how to pay them to help you deal with it. The government is torn apart by the conflicted interests of the two political parties who are trying to figure out how to use a disease to do what they want, namely win elections or get popular support. So what you end up is cacophony, noise,
right.
Not music, noise, and eventually people do what is in fact the goal. They tune it out. They deal with it, and then they come up with their own explanations. So on one side, that can be, I don't know, QAnon. On the other side, it can be imputing God knows what motivations to the pharmaceutical companies or to your local druggist or whoever. And you're on your own in making this stuff up because you've tuned out the larger world because it is so obviously untrustworthy. Let me give you another example, which may cause me some trouble. I maybe get called that name that you got called, although it hasn't happened to me yet. The United States started about a year or two ago, discovering that it wanted to change its relationship to China. So Mr. Trump decided, especially because he was charged with being somehow in cahoots with Russia and Putin, that he would demonstrate his bona fides to good old American patriots by beating up on China. So he declared a trade war on China. He slapped them with every kind of tariff that he could. He tried to figure out what he could do to at least appear to be the big tough guy vis-a-vis China. And one of the ways this was done was to look for and to find the Chinese doing something which may very well be ugly and indefensible. Mm-hmm. I really don't know. I'm talking, of course, about the small 10 to 12 million Muslim minority, Uyghurs, I believe they're pronounced, in one remote part of China. Now, I am no expert. I admit that. I don't take a position. I don't know what exactly is going on there. Could it be as awful as the U.S. presents it? Yeah, could be. Could it be as not awful as the Chinese present it? Yep, but here I am. I've got two conflicting, and they ask me in that situation either to write a blank check to the Chinese, oh, you're fine, or to write a blank check to the United States, oh, it's awful, or to use the language that the United States is now using, genocide. You know, we've had real genocides in the world. You're not honoring the real ones by using it in this manner. But here's the thing that makes the rest of the world start to look at the United States with a mixture of sneer and laughing at us. We are a country that for the last 25 years has been or nearly 25, in a continuous war against Muslims. The very story you told about the drone strike in Kabul, all the victims there were Muslims. The children, the adults, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, if you add together all those who were killed or wounded in Afghanistan, a Muslim country, in Iraq, a Muslim country, in Libya, a Muslim country, in Syria, a largely Muslim country, by Americans or American-supported agencies. We have been a damage to the Muslim people of this world on an enormous scale that everybody in the world knows. We are not in a position to call genocidal whatever is done. The combined population by the Chinese in the Uyghur area, whatever is done to the 70 million people, that's the combined population of Afghanistan and Iraq. The population of the Uyghurs, as I said to you, is 10 to 12 million, as best I can determine. So we're talking about a damage done to these economies by 20 years of warfare. And that's not just the people killed by a drone or a bomb. That's the people who die of a treatable disease because the hospital is gone, or the hospital is too far away, or the hospital can't be reached by transportation that has been bombed out of existence. I mean, if you did the work properly, you would never dare do what the United States is doing. It's not just that we do propaganda, but we have to do propaganda on reaching to the levels of ridiculousness that make the propaganda boomerang on us. That's why people around the world, particularly Muslims, find all of this beyond belief, even beyond ridicule, to have such a spectacle in which one is asked to sign up behind the United States, which has been at war against Muslims. You know, I'm not even talking about turning them away from entry into the United States, suffering discriminations of all kinds inside the United States. I could go on, but our position championing those 12 million, whatever is happening to them, is crazy. And of course, it makes the Chinese have to, close ranks to defend themselves. So whatever is going on there, we won't really know. And we're dealing with two propaganda machines making fun of us by the noise that they create, a little bit like the fossil fuel companies creating noise around what we now know burning fossil fuels does to the climate.
And just to add to your litany regarding the Muslim world, let's not leave out the sanctions. against Iraq, for example, and Iran, and the harm they've done to people, including children there. Yeah. We could go on and on. I mean, the point is that, of course, it doesn't stop there. And getting back to the cacophony, Richard Wolff, that you mentioned earlier, part of it's a lone. You can be the loneliest guy in town sometimes if you just want to know what the truth is, right? So the fact is, I'm no fan of Putin. I'm no fan of anybody who's got a lot of oligarchs around them. Again, a lonely position, one might argue. But the fact is, my skepticism about the Havana syndrome didn't come because of any ideological position or any loyalty to one or another country. It came because the story didn't make sense, and because there wasn't evidence for it. Now what we're talking about with the Uyghurs is even trickier, because the fact is, you're absolutely correct, we don't know. But the statistics of millions of people in concentration camps, my friend Max Blumenthal says, and others have said there's only one source, and it's an ideological source for that number. So I don't deny, or, like you, I have no idea. But merely in this environment, I think most of us are not aware. We think about Soviet Russia or other totalitarian states in terms of, or George Orwell in terms of this kind of thing. But I think we sometimes forget how much we ourselves are afraid to ask questions or doubt the official narrative, because there's a price that comes with that.
Absolutely, there is a price, and most Americans are fearful. They don't want to admit it, that they're afraid. So part of why they go along with this dominant narrative is because they don't want to face their own fear. They don't want to admit what you're opening, which is really a kind of Pandora's box. Because if we, in fact, admit we can't rely, then what is it we are believing? Let me give you another way to get at it. I remember as a young man growing up and hearing adults in the room tell you how the politicians are all crooks. I used to hear that. And they're only out to line their own pockets. And then when those exact same politicians called upon these adults to deliver their sons, and I was one of them, to the military to go fight a war, all of these adults suddenly believed the same politicians they had called crooks the night before. These people became the providers of absolute truth, and they would sacrifice their own children in support of that truth. I didn't understand psychology at that time, but I was a smart enough kid to know there's something wrong here. There's some disconnect that made the politician my father and his friends wanted me not to respect. The next morning, announcing the war in Vietnam, I was to believe all of this and go die in the name of all of this without a question, without a doubt, without a worry. I was on God's side, all the rest of it. I mean, amazing. If you see it in its moment, you'll never be fooled again. And I think an awful lot of Americans hesitate to go down that road, not because they don't know. They went through experiences like the one I just described when they were young too. They know somewhere, but it is too scary to open that up. What am I reading when I open the New York Times or the Washington Post or Time magazine? Whoa, how do I, and if I can't be confident, where am I? What is it I have been told? And these questions are deeply destabilizing. And at a time like ours now, when this country is in many ways falling apart, I think it's even harder for people, even though their environment pushes them in that direction as it falls apart. It's scary to face it.
And what you've described is, to me, an emotionally and cognitively fragmented existence, a perilous way of trying to navigate your way through life at a time in history, as perhaps all times in history have been, where you wonder, about your security now and in the future. And so if I return to the topic we began with, which is the plastics, imagine now one is in this fragmented state we've just described, in a situation of genuine peril. And if they happen to be reading The Guardian, which used to be a left-wing newspaper, one would argue about that now perhaps, but for an article that begins, quote, "The cocktail of chemical pollution that pervades the planet now threatens the stability of global ecosystems upon which humanity depends," scientists have said. How does one get that idea, a sentence like that, an idea like that, injected into your cognitive bloodstream when you're already driven half insane by all the dissonance we've just described?
Well, I think there's a dynamic here that, and time will tell. You can get away with that. You can get away with routinizing that, trivializing that, converting a slaughter into a botched maneuver and all of that. You can do all that, but it goes into the brain. And my guess is it's what Hegel taught me about the difference between quality and quantity. You can hold on to the same quality and increase the quantity, but at a certain point, a little more of that quantity and the quality changes. And let me give you an example. This is from Hegel. You can lower the temperature of water from 80 degrees to 70 to 60. It's water, it's water. And then you get to 33. And you lower it again, say to 31, and suddenly the liquid becomes a solid. The quality of this entity changes. Well, you can keep fooling the people, if I can borrow another phrase that gets at it. You can fool them for a long time. You can get them to buy into, to become complicit. But if you keep going down that road, precisely because it worked for you, you're going to have a comeuppance. You're going to have that time when you do it once again in the full confidence that having done it all along, you can get away with it, and suddenly, no. And let me give you an example right now today. The country we live in, you and I, is now awash in a level of conflicting explanations and analyses about COVID and what the different, Omicron versus Delta, and whether vaccines do or don't work, and whether and on. And the pharmaceuticals are in there doing what they need for their profit. Republicans are doing what they need to win an election. Democrats are trying to, everybody's in there with that cacophony. And so masses of people are coming up with ad hoc solutions, none of which work, and some of which are quite fantastic. Okay. But in France, where the same thing was going on, over the last 2 weeks, something has changed. And I really urge people watching or listening to this to take a look. Across France, a coalition of school students, school teachers, and most importantly, school parents of the kids in school have gone into the streets. The French do that, of course. They actually believe in popular democracy rather than just talk the talk. So they get out in the street, and here's what they're saying. They don't believe the schools are safe. They don't believe the government has done anywhere near what it could and should have done to give everybody a mask, to clean the room, to do the things which cost money, but which should have been done if you have a notion about the sanctity of human life, particularly that of children, okay? And they're in the streets, and the government of Mr. Macron, once again, he's got almost single-digit approval, fellow has. COVID was great for him because people couldn't go into the streets, those yellow vests. Well, they're coming back. They're so desperate now that there's a coordination in the streets of France. That is a sign. You can go so far, but then you will be surprised. You'll do another step, confident it'll work as well as all the others, and instead it blows up in your face.
Well, now, I guess I know you're going to have to leave, but I guess as a closing thought, it seems to me that this cacophony that has been cobbled together to keep people on the straight and narrow in this society is on the verge potentially of exploding. And that's part of what you're describing, or collapsing. And if so, my personal hope and fear, two-sided coin, is that could either turn out to give people new insights and motivate them to positive action, or lead to a kind of right-wing nihilistic anarchy. So, closing thoughts, any?
Yes, I agree with you, and let me give you the current reality. I think that embodies just what you've said. I think the American working class has had it. They've been pushed for the last 30 years. Our average real rate of growth of the real wage in this country has averaged less than half of 1% per year. Given what statistics are, that's stagnation. The only reason our working class could even continue in the last 30 to 40 years was by doing two things: working more jobs, exhausting themselves, and borrowing more money than any working class in the world had ever done, which means we get to 2008 and they're exhausted and anxiety ridden because they know they can't pay off their debts. The way if you talk to college students today, they will tell you, I can never pay off what I had to borrow to get my college degree. But then you put them through 2 years of a depression plus COVID. That's too much. And then when it's over, now you slap them all in the face with an inflation, which is raising their prices faster than that. It is too much. You keep pushing, you keep sticking it to the working class, you keep building the gap between rich and poor to levels. Oxfam this week released the statistics, levels that take you back to ancient Egypt and pharaohs. They're so grotesque. And guess what? Millions and millions of workers up and quit their jobs. A little personal act we didn't see before on this scale, of workers saying, take this job and shove it. And these workers are having a problem because they leave an employer imagining that the problem is finding a different employer. They're learning there's a system here. The employers are all doing what the system imposes on them too. So then other workers are making strikes, trying to change the job and encountering all the strategic problems. The question is, will these two communities, the quitters and the fighters, begin to understand that the issue is to change the system? If that happens, we will get a progressive outcome to this failing system. If not, we'll get more people like Bolsonaro or Modi or Erdogan or Trump giving us fantastic right-wing theater while they don't solve any problems either.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. But as always, Richard Wolff, enlightening and fascinating and pleasurable to speak with you, even if our topics are not always so exciting or pleasurable. Richard Wolff again, economist, host of Economic Update. As always, thanks for coming on the program.
And thank you, RJ, and I look forward to our next conversation.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.